Europe, mid-14th century. A mysterious plague spread silently across towns, villages, and busy trade ports. No one knows where it came from or how to stop it. What began as a few unexplained deaths soon turned into one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Ships crawling with rats arrive at harbors. Streets fill with fear and confusion. Families lock themselves inside their homes, hoping the sickness will pass them by. But nothing could stop it. This is the story of a catastrophe that reshaped the world forever. This is the Black Death. The Black Death did not begin in Europe. Most historians trace its origins to Central Asia, where the plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis, spread along ancient trade routes. By the early 1340s, the disease reached the Crimean port city of Kaffa, where a fierce conflict was underway between Mongol forces and Genoese merchants. As the Mongol army fell sick, they made a desperate and terrifying decision. They hurled the bodies of plague victims over the city walls, unknowingly triggering one of history's first acts of biological warfare. The terrified merchants fled by sea, believing they had escaped death. But the true danger was already on board, hidden in the fleas carried by the rats in their ships. From Kaffa, the plague sailed into the heart of Europe. In October 1347, a fleet of Genoese ships arrived in the port of Sicily. The sailors on board were dying, feverish, weak, and covered in black, swollen sores. Within days, the disease spread through the city. People collapsed in markets, in narrow streets, even inside their homes. From Sicily, the plague leapt from port to port. Marseille, Genoa, Venice. Every ship that arrived brought death with it. Medieval cities, crowded and filthy, were perfect breeding grounds. Rats thrived in the food markets, warehouses, and streets. And the fleas they carried jumped easily to humans. By early 1348, the Black Death had entered mainland Europe, and nothing could stop it. Once the plague took hold, its symptoms appeared with terrifying speed. It began with a sudden fever, chills, and a crushing weakness that forced people to the ground. Within hours, black swellings, called buboes, formed under the arms, on the neck, and in the groin. These swollen lumps were agonizing, often growing as large as an egg. Victims coughed blood, suffered unbearable pain, and drifted in and out of delirium. Many died within just 2 or 3 days. Families barricaded themselves inside their homes, hoping to escape the invisible enemy. Mothers hid their children. Neighbors avoided each other, and the sound of mourning filled every street. The Black Death was not just a sickness. It was a horrifying transformation of the human body, swift, brutal, and unstoppable. As the plague spread from house to house and village to village, medieval society began to crumble. Markets emptied, shops closed their doors, and the once busy streets became haunted by fear and silence. People abandoned their sick relatives, terrified that a single touch could seal their fate. Priests refused to give last rites. Doctors, those who remained, wore crude protective clothing, but it did little to shield them. Entire families vanished within days. Whole neighborhoods fell quiet as death carts rolled through the streets, collecting bodies at dawn and dusk. Trade collapsed. Farms were abandoned, and cities that once thrived were reduced to shadows of their former selves. The fabric of everyday life, work, faith, community began to fall apart. The Black Death was no longer just a disease. It was the collapse of an entire world. As the plague spread from house to house and village to village, medieval society began to crumble. Markets emptied, shops closed their doors, and the once busy streets became haunted by fear and silence. People abandoned their sick relatives, terrified that a single touch could seal their fate. Priests refused to give last rites. Doctors, those who remained, wore crude protective clothing, but it did little to shield them. Entire families vanished within days. Whole neighborhoods fell quiet as death carts rolled through the streets, collecting bodies at dawn and dusk. Trade collapsed. Farms were abandoned, and cities that once thrived were reduced to shadows of their former selves. The fabric of everyday life, work, faith, community, began to fall apart. The Black Death was no longer just a disease. It was the collapse of an entire world. By 1348, the Black Death had reached its horrifying peak. In some cities, half the population died within just a few months. Death carts rolled through the streets day and night, collecting bodies from doorways and alleyways. Church bells rang constantly until even the priests were too sick or too exhausted to continue. Graveyards overflowed. Fields outside the city walls were dug into massive pits, where hundreds of victims were buried together. Often, there were not enough workers to dig, and not enough time to mourn. Fear overshadowed every aspect of life. People refused to touch each other, speak to each other, or even look at one another for too long. Entire towns were silenced. Once vibrant marketplaces fell still. Homes were abandoned, meals left half-eaten, doors left open to the wind. This was the darkest moment of the European Middle Ages, a time when it felt as though the world itself was dying. By the early 1350s, the Black Death finally began to fade. Not because it had been cured, but because it had already taken everyone it could. Survivors emerged from their homes cautiously, stepping into streets that felt unfamiliar and empty. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, replaced by silence and overgrown weeds. Farmers returned to abandoned fields. Merchants reopened quiet market stalls. Families searched the ruins of their towns for anyone left alive. Though weakened and traumatized, Europe slowly began to breathe again. Every survivor carried scars, memories of loved ones lost, and a world that would never be the same. But with the passing of the plague came something else as well, a chance to rebuild. From the ashes of tragedy, a new era was about to begin. The Black Death did not simply fade into history, it transformed Europe forever. With millions gone, labor became scarce. Farmers, craftsmen, and workers suddenly found their skills in high demand. For the first time, ordinary people could demand better wages, better treatment, and greater freedom. Many villages were abandoned, but others grew into new centers of trade and opportunity. The old social order, built on strict hierarchies, began to crack. The church, once unquestioned, lost much of its authority. People had prayed endlessly for salvation, yet the plague continued to claim lives. Faith remained, but trust in institutions faded. Medicine, too, began to change. Doctors realized that ancient traditions were not enough. Slowly, Europe moved toward observation, science, and the early foundations of modern medicine. In the ashes of tragedy, society reshaped itself. The Black Death, despite its horror, pushed Europe into a new age, one with fewer people but new ideas, new freedoms, and a different future. The Black Death was one of the darkest chapters in human history. It swept across continents, shattered families, erased entire towns, and left an unimaginable void in its wake. Yet even in the silence that followed, life slowly began to return. Survivors rebuilt homes that had stood empty for years. Fields that had grown wild were cultivated once more. Children who had lost everything learned to laugh again, and markets reopened with the cautious hope of a new beginning. The scars remained, etched into the memories of those who lived through the terror. But in those scars, Europe found a strange form of renewal. With fewer people, land and opportunities changed hands. Old systems weakened, rigid hierarchies loosened. Voices that once went unheard began to rise. The plague reshaped the economy, shifted power, and quietly laid the foundation for the world that would come after: the Renaissance, modernization, and new ways of thinking. It is a reminder that history is not just a record of suffering, but also of resilience. The people of the 14th century endured unimaginable loss, yet they rebuilt piece by piece, brick by brick, life by life. And as centuries passed, their story became a lesson carried through time, that even in humanity's darkest moments, there is always the possibility of renewal. The Black Death changed the course of history forever, but it did not end it. From devastation came transformation, and from tragedy came